we have decided to enhance our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
NATO bolsters its military presence in the east and announces new strategic moves to counter threats to the alliance. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Leaders from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization gathered in Warsaw over the weekend to map out a response to numerous challenges. Among items on the agenda, Islamic extremism, the war in Afghanistan, Britain's exit from the European Union, and Ukraine's sovereignty. Hanging over the meeting was tension within the alliance over how to respond to what some call a resurgent Russia. Later, we'll get the Russian perspective and talk with the former United States representatives to NATO. But first, for more on the summit itself, we begin in Warsaw with CCTV's Guy Henderson. And Guy, as we heard from the Secretary General, NATO plans to boost security along its eastern flank. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, the big news out of this NATO summit is that NATO has given the formal go-ahead for around 4,000 soldiers, 4 battalions to be deployed to various countries across Eastern Europe. They are expected to deploy in early 2017. They will be deployed, though, on a rotational basis, not permanent bases. That's important because NATO argues that it's not, therefore, in violation of the Founding Act, a cooperation agreement signed between Moscow and NATO countries in the 1990s. In addition to that, a multinational brigade will also be deployed to Romania. That is also expected to start in early 2017. On the one hand, classic deterrence. On the other, though, dialogue. The Russia-NATO Council will begin to meet again. It's already done so once this year, and they will have another meeting in Brussels on Wednesday.
Now, the war in Afghanistan, that was another major item on the agenda at this NATO summit. What was decided?
Well, officials here in Warsaw have talked about how this NATO summit will be seen as the creation of NATO 3.0. A number of decisions made here that are aimed to try and change the way that this organisation operates, primarily to deal with the evolving threat of terrorism. In Afghanistan, a slightly more conventional response there. Troop levels will be maintained at 12,000 or so troops in the coming years. And NATO has also pledged $1 billion a year or around that for at least the next 3 years. In Iraq, a current training mission currently operating in Jordan will be moved to train Iraqi security forces in Iraq itself, and also extra assistance will be provided to special forces in Tunisia. This is all part, the officials argue, or point out, of a change in strategy away from direct, large-scale deployment of NATO personnel, and instead forming long-term partnerships with local actors, local institutions, to build up capacity of local forces themselves.
Thanks, Guy. That's CCTV's Guy Henderson reporting from Warsaw. Joining us from Beijing is the director of the China National Association of International Studies, Victor Gao. With us from St. Petersburg, Russia, is Vladimir Goldstein. He teaches Slavic Studies at Brown University. And joining us here in Washington is Kurt Volker. Among his many posts, he served as the U.S. permanent representative to NATO. Thanks to all of you. Ambassador, let me start with you. Well, one of the headlines that came out of the summit was that NATO will deploy more troops and equipment to the countries on the eastern border of the alliance, 4 battalions, 4,000 troops. Why deploy these troops? Are they meant to be a deterrent to Russia, or can they actually counter an attack from Russia, or is it symbolic?
Well, deterrence and symbolism go together. These are not of a size that could potentially take on Russia in any way. Russia has divisions on the other side of the border. We're talking, a battalion in each country. But it is symbolic because it is multinational and it is on the territory of these NATO allies. And what it is meant to symbolize is that in the event there were an attack against one of these countries, that NATO has the will and the capability to respond. These forces themselves are not sufficient for that, but it shows that the alliance as a whole has that intention. And that is meant to try to stabilize the situation, because over the last several years, we've seen Russia invade Georgia, we've seen them invade Ukraine, occupy territory, annex Crimea, build up their military, violate countries' airspace, threaten nuclear use. So in that environment where allies are becoming more and more nervous, this is meant as a way to say, no, we do have the will and the capability. We can defend these countries. Let's see if we can stabilize the situation and then go back to dialogue with Russia again from there.
Right. One other quick decision they took when that was to deploy a missile defense system. Will that defense system effectively render Russia's nuclear missile system ineffective?
Absolutely not, because Russia has thousands and thousands and thousands of missiles of various ranges. And what NATO is putting together is a system that is capable of taking out a few missiles. We're talking tens of missiles at the most that it would be able to take out. And that is really aimed at protecting against a rogue state that might fire off a missile or two. Being able to protect a population center from that has no way that it would be able to overcome or deal with the scale of Russia's missile capabilities.
Vladimir, when we look at these decisions taken by NATO, will Russia see these deployments, both the missile defense system as well as the battalions that are being deployed, as a provocation? And how will Russia respond?
Well, I think Russia is put in a very difficult position because, on the one hand, they know that they are not being aggressive, that they have their capabilities. They're watching the NATO troops, they're watching what's going on. And they know that this is primarily a media campaign because they are not doing anything, drastic. And furthermore, they know that people in NATO and Pentagon know very well that Russia is not doing anything drastic. So we're talking about, NATO media blitzkrieg, so to speak. All these things which is going on recently, including this Warsaw meeting and all this agreement of sending 4 battalions in different Baltic countries, this is primarily played for the local public, for American public, for English public, for German public, and so on. Because I don't think it's a question of real military escalation. However, this myopic policy, this kind of saber rattling, might be translated eventually, unexpectedly, unintentionally, into something very, very serious. Because this saber rattling can cause a real military confrontation. That's why Russia is definitely not very happy about it. They hope that sane heads will prevail, but this media campaign is very dangerous. And Russians are repeated again and again and again. If you have some issues with us, let's discuss it. If something happens, let's discuss it one-on-one rather than jump into the press and complaining. Like, for example, over Ukraine, when this Malaysian plane was hit, right away there was, jury and judge and everything in the media. Russia was blamed without any research. The same thing is going on again. Russia is blamed for aggression. Russia is blamed for this and that. And, there is no sign of Russia doing anything with the Baltics. Ukraine is a specific case which should be discussed with all concerned, people and could have been resolved without an issue. But as I said, NATO is playing some particular, game for the public.
Ambassador, do you want to respond to that, that this deployment could be symbolic, but as Vladimir Goldstein points out, it could escalate into a confrontation?
Right. I think what NATO is more concerned about is Russian adventurism or experimentation. What we saw with Ukraine, for instance, was the use of hybrid warfare, where you put in special forces and intelligence officers and foment unrest, and then use that unrest as a justification for intervening. And Russia has both taken part of Ukrainian territory and then supports the separatists that are there. And there are Russian soldiers that have died fighting in Ukraine, and that's been a source of concern domestically in Moscow. So in order to avoid Russia experimenting in the Baltic states, saying, well, maybe we could try hybrid warfare there. There are Russian-speaking populations. We could look at, they did abduct an Estonian intelligence officer from Estonian territory right after President Obama's visit there last year. In order to try to prevent those sort of things, it is the idea of putting a symbolic presence to dissuade Russia from doing that. And as our guest just said, there is a difference between Ukraine and the Baltic states. Baltic states are members of the European Union, members of NATO, developed countries. The Russian-speaking populations, they are relatively content. So it would be much more difficult for Russia to do that.
Ukraine is not a member of NATO, right?
Ukraine is not.
Right. Victor, let's go to Victor in Beijing. How is China viewing all these developments?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, definitely NATO itself is a creation of the Cold War together with the former Warsaw Pact. Now that the Cold War is over, now that the Warsaw Pact has been dismantled, NATO should also, theoretically or philosophically speaking, cease to exist. However, NATO not only survived, but keeps expanding. And I think just now the ambassador mentioned problems involving Ukraine and other places. We need to ask the philosophical question whether these problems are the symptoms or the root causes of the expansion of NATO. I would say, in all fairness to Russia and to all the other NATO members, I would say that Russia was reacting to the threat of expansion of NATO into the Caucasus, into Ukraine, etc. And I would say Russia probably will dig in against any attempted expansion of NATO. And in the Baltic region, of course, Russia has vested interest, but there is no threat of Russia invading into any part of the Baltic region. Now that NATO is talking about expansion, further stationing troops in countries like Finland or even the neutral country of Sweden, I think that's too much. NATO, by doing this, is no longer keeping peace. It's threatening peace and stability, not only in the European part of the world, but probably would spill over to other parts of the world.
Ambassador, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, he talked about the NATO summit. In fact, he made some statements before the summit actually started. Let's take a listen to what he said.
We don't intend to give in to this militaristic frenzy, but it seems that is what they are pushing us to provoke a costly and pointless arms race, divert our forces and resources from solving our own important social and economic issues. This will not happen.
So is there a danger here, Ambassador, that we could see another arms race and a resumption of the Cold War?
Two things. First, to address that question and what President Putin was saying. President Putin is always very, very good at communicating. He is trying to influence decision-making by what he says. It has no bearing necessarily on whether it's true or not. He's trying to influence Western and publics and Western decision-makers. It was the I believe it was the president, the prime minister of Russia at the Munich Security Conference in February, who himself said, we are in a new Cold War, which took a lot of the participants there by surprise, because no one in the West thinks or wants to be in such a situation. When you look at what's happened since the Cold War, since 1989, 91, there's been a drastic reduction in military capabilities in Europe. Defense budgets have fallen. We used to talk about 2% of GDP. Now many countries are around 1%. U.S. forces used to be in several hundreds of thousands. We are now looking at about 38,000. There was a point at which all U.S. armor had been withdrawn from Europe. We've had to put a little bit back now. We are at substantially lower levels. But what we've seen is that in the past few years, maybe 5, Russia has both used its military forces in Georgia and in Ukraine, and it has stepped up its military expenditures in development and training. No one objects to Russia having a strong military, but the use of that military in neighboring countries is what's alarming NATO countries. Now, there's a point here from your Beijing guest that I wanted to return to. It's very important. NATO is not an organization that is run by a central authority and is going out and acquiring territory and expanding in the way that he just talked about it. NATO is an association of countries that make their own decisions about their own security orientation. Countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Romania. These are countries that have had a very difficult history. They've been occupied by the Soviet Union with military forces in the case of the Central European states there. When they became democratic countries and free countries, they wanted to be secure. And they said, we would like to be part of the European family, we'd like to be part of the EU, we want to be part of NATO, because NATO is an association of countries that pledge to work together towards their mutual self-defense.
Okay, let me get Vladimir Goldstein's view on that. Vladimir, before we get to what the ambassador was saying, let's listen to what the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said about these latest deployments. Let's watch this.
What we see is more unpredictability, more uncertainties, and we also see a more assertive Russia, which has substantially built up its military capabilities, modernized its armed forces, trained its forces, and tripled defense spending over or since 2000 over the last years. We have also seen a Russia which has been willing to use military force against neighbors.
So, Vladimir, the NATO view here is that Russia is the aggressor and that NATO's eastern members need protection.
Well, this is a line which State Department and NATO leadership and Washington and some European leaders take, but it's not based on facts. You know, the whole issue of legitimacy of NATO is in front of us, because we know that NATO had its role, as Victor observed, at certain point of time. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is no point of having NATO, let alone expanded it. So they need to justify their existence. They need to come up with these stories of Russian aggression. You know, we have to look at the history. When Soviet Union invaded Hungary in '56, it was a bully, it was an aggressor. When it invaded and took tanks to the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia in '69, it was an aggressor. Now we have NATO tanks running loose, German tanks, American battalions on the Russian border. Russia is not doing anything. What are they doing there? You know, the problem is that they can convince themselves about their legitimacy, but what have to be stressed that the public opinion is not buying it anymore. There is a lot of voices, including going to the very top. German Foreign Minister Steinmeier said we should stop provoking Russia. There's no point, there's no real threat, there is no aggression. Russia is much smaller. It spends much less money on the defense than combined NATO countries, than US and so on. So they really create this bogeyman. They keep on sort of making up these stories. Now they're looking for submarine in Sweden. Now they do this and that. Another thing I should stress, that it's not quite fair for European public, for American public, to get their opinion about Russian aggression from countries like Baltics or Poland. Just let's imagine, for example, if you want to get opinion about Middle East conflict and you just go and talk only to Palestinians. Of course, Palestinians would tell you that Israelis are the greatest, killers in the world. Or if you go just to Israelis, they will tell you that only Palestinians are just terrorists and so on. We have to get a real opinion.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about NATO's latest strategic moves following a two-day meeting in Warsaw. Let's get back to our panel. Victor, the NATO summit also reaffirmed its commitment to Afghanistan. In fact, it decided to maintain a military presence there and commit $5 billion per year to fund Afghan security forces. Now, China is also committed to Afghans, or at least the Afghanistan development and security. So is it likely we're going to see some cooperation between China and NATO in Afghanistan?
Well, I do hope China and NATO can have some meaningful cooperation. But as far as the situation in Afghanistan is concerned, the US and NATO war in Afghanistan is a complete disaster. It has not solved any problem in Afghanistan in any meaningful way. Therefore, I don't think it will be worthwhile for China to cooperate with NATO as far as the war situation in Afghanistan is concerned. But allow me to add very quickly one point about what the ambassador was just now saying about countries willingly joining NATO. In the early 1960s, when the former Soviet Union based the missiles in Cuba, Cuba was happy to accept these missiles. Why should the United States obstruct that? Why should the United States set up a quarantine to keep the Soviet missile away from Cuba? Of course, the United States felt threatened if the Soviet Union kept their missiles in Cuba. It's the same thing. If NATO want to acquire countries like Georgia, I bet that Russia will stand up and firmly oppose that. If NATO want to expand into Ukraine, Russia will fight against that. If NATO want to include countries like Mongolia into NATO, both China and Russia will fight against that and will keep Mongolia from joining NATO. Why? Because when you keep expanding, the presence of NATO threatens other countries. China does not want to have a member or a neighbor joining NATO, which brings NATO to China's doorstep. We do not want to have NATO on our doorstep. That's the same reason for President Kennedy to decide to keep the Soviet missiles away from Cuba. Therefore, don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. That's the same philosophy, I would say.
Ambassador?
Well, the fundamental difference between your Beijing guest and I is that he is saying that China or Russia have a right to tell other countries what they can do. And what I'm saying is that neither China, neither Russia, neither the US has a right to tell other countries what they can do.
But he made the point that that is exactly what the United States...
No, what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis was Russian missiles, and it was treated as a bilateral U.S.-Russia issue, or Soviet missiles, and a U.S.-Soviet issue where we wanted to see those missiles withdrawn, and they were withdrawn. It wasn't about Cuba.
Vladimir Goltsyn, I want to talk about Ukraine for a moment. The NATO Secretary General also said that a stable, democratic Ukraine is central to Europe's security. How does Russia view that, and what does Russia think NATO wants to do in Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine under Yanukovych wasn't an ideal place at all. There are a lot of legitimate grievances. People were not happy with his rule. He was corrupt, and so on. However, when the United States decided to interfere and decided to sponsor a coup which occurred in Kiev, they more or less generated a civil war. What we have in Ukraine is the western part of Ukraine, which wants a particular way of government, particular language, particular culture to be imposed on the eastern Ukraine, which is not happy with it. So once Yanukovych was out, a particular regime was installed, sponsored by Victoria Nuland, who said Yats should be in charge, and so on. And these people began to dominate, and they wanted to impose their will on the eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was clearly not happy about it. Of course, Russia realized that with this civil war emerging, they should make sure that they protect their fleet, they should protect their sort of historical place in Crimea, and they acted, and I think they acted absolutely rationally. Furthermore, people in Crimea agreed with it. They wanted to get out of this mess. What US is doing recently, or NATO, or all this newly emerged blocs are doing, is creating havoc and civil wars. Look at Iraq, again, the same thing. The situation wasn't, ideal. The ruler, Saddam Hussein, wasn't ideal. But what we have is civil war. So Ukraine is still going on. And what I find fascinating, that nobody wants to acknowledge it. They try to say that, the Kiev bombing of eastern Ukraine is some kind of an attempt to fend off Russian aggression. This is not. Everybody should send their correspondence and talk to people, and they would tell you how much they resent this Kiev government. So what we have is a situation of civil war. Russia is trying to sort of, obviously sort of help one side, or at least prevent them from being killed. Kiev is trying to get new weapons, new advisors, new help from NATO. So NATO is playing not a peaceful role, not a defensive role, but in fact the role which it's been doing recently, by creating havoc in the Middle East and Ukraine and, in Georgia.
Victor, part of the new initiatives that NATO also announced after the summit was that there'd be a new joint intelligence and security division to respond to evolving threats, as the summit put it. Now, taken with the rest of the announcements that were made coming out of Warsaw, what's your overall reaction?
Well, I think if NATO wants to play a positive role in fighting against global terrorism, for example, of course, all the other countries, including China, probably will be happy to cooperate with NATO when they strengthen their security arrangement. However, the concern is that NATO may actually use this as an excuse so that they may beef up their capabilities, which other countries may find them as a threat to their survival and national security. And in that sense, I think NATO should really be more tempered in their desire to become an instrument of war or military adventure, because in the longer term, philosophically speaking, whichever entity, including NATO, which wants to indulge in the fantasy that they can use military means to prevail against other countries, it may just force the other side, including Russia, to team up with other countries and become redoubly stronger. So therefore, the prospect of a major arms race is a real it may bankrupt some countries. Overreaching by any empire will eventually cause the corruption and the collapse of their own regime.
Very quickly, Victor, there are some who argue that NATO is obsolete, and among those who argue that NATO is obsolete, as we've heard, is the current Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump. He questions its usefulness in a post-Cold War era. Do you agree?
I think NATO is obsolete. Why? Because the Europeans are now talking about setting up their own army, the European-based army. I think that will be a much better way, because European countries do not want to be held hostage by the ideological pursuit of other major powers embodied in NATO. I think European countries should have their own army.
Ambassador, one other issue. When we look at the wide range of threats that countries face around the world, arguably ISIL poses a huge threat. Its members have attacked at least 2 European countries. We saw attacks in France, we saw attacks in Belgium as well. What is NATO doing about that?
Unfortunately, very little. And I wish that NATO was playing a more active role. The problem, as I see it, with dealing with ISIL is that we have a United States that has been very reluctant to really take the fight to ISIL. We've been very limited in the means that we're willing to use, aerial bombing, but not much else. And we have a very fractured coalition. We have a coalition, but a very fractured coalition when you talk about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, maybe Russia. Russia's helping the Assad regime, but says it's also against ISIL. Jordan, the United States. Iran is helping the Assad regime as well. Unclear how much they're going against ISIL. So we have a very fractured approach to dealing with them. In that situation, NATO is really going to be unable to do more than this coalition itself is able to do together. It's not going to be able to step over that and take a lead in some way. So I think NATO is actually playing a rather ineffective role at the moment compared to what it could do.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Ambassador Kurt Volker, Vladimir Goldstein, Victor Gao, thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.